And now we'll hear from Hans Bethe.
I'm happy to say that I agree with Edward Teller on one thing, and that is that our eyes are the most important of our safeguards, that we must by all means preserve our intelligence satellites and also our early warning satellites. And one of the things he has proposed may be a good way to do it, namely to duplicate them. But now let me proceed with what I meant to say. 40 years ago, Los Alamos led the world into the nuclear weapons age. Nuclear weapons ended the war with Japan, and as far as we can tell, prevented the takeover of Western Europe by the Soviets, as long as we had sole possession or great superiority in nuclear weapons. That time is over. It has now led to the greatest insecurity for the whole world, both east and west of the Iron Curtain. It would be good if Los Alamos could help to lead the world out of this age of insecurity. I am not for Star Wars. I was the scientist whom Edward mentioned, who was invited to Livermore, and I was impressed by the physics ideas in the X-ray laser. In the meantime, I am even more impressed by the operational arguments, some of which Dick Garwin has given you earlier. I believe that Los Alamos should stay away from Star Wars. It's enough if one good laboratory engages in this. Increasing numbers of military experts have concluded that nuclear weapons are not weapons of war. This includes some recent high leaders of the military in Great Britain. It includes some of the most knowledgeable retired admirals of the United States. They are not weapons of war. Nuclear weapons can serve only one purpose, and that is to prevent a potential enemy from using them against us. From this point of view, and this, in my opinion, is the only real point of view of real use of nuclear weapons. From this point of view, I claim that the United States is better prepared than Soviet Russia against an unprovoked attack by the other side, because most of our weapons are in invulnerable submarines. There is no, I'm assured that there is no prospect in the foreseeable future that nuclear submarines can be detected and attacked. We have a greater fraction of our weapons in these submarines than the Russians do. We have a greater total of nuclear warheads, and therefore, if the president thinks that Russia is superior in strategic weapons, I believe that the people who advise him have misinformed him. If nuclear weapons were used in Europe, they would do far more damage to our friends than to our enemies, because our friends are right near the front line, And if the war is fought near the front line, it will destroy the very densely populated area in Western Europe. Therefore, the threat of using nuclear weapons to counter a possible Soviet invasion into Western Europe with conventional weapons is, as the jargon has it, not credible. The Soviets will act in their own interest. They do want goods from Western Europe. There are many goods which Western Europe can produce and they cannot. Therefore, I believe we should encourage, we, the United States, should encourage trade between Western Europe and Soviet Russia, not discourage it. We should encourage other peaceful relations, both by Western Europe and ourselves with Soviet Russia. Making war on Europe on the part of the Soviet Union would destroy the source of many goods which they depend on. And in this connection, I also want to say that it is important to resume the exchanges of scientists between Soviet Russia and the United States, between the East and the West, because it is the scientists very largely who are the new generation that Edward talked about, who are different from the governing people in the Soviet Union, and who are, to a quite large extent, having the same ideas about peace as we have. We have to encourage them by talking to them. It is no good for us, as it is no good for them, to have stopped these exchanges. The Soviet conventional weapons in Europe are, I believe, stronger than ours, in contrast to the strategic nuclear weapons which I mentioned before. I said before that I don't believe the Soviets have any incentive to attack Western Europe with a massive conventional attack. This has not been the way they have acted, and I don't see that it will be the way. But suppose they did attack Western Europe with conventional weapons. As I said before, our threat to use nuclear weapons is empty. It is not credible because it will destroy at least our friends in Western Europe and probably also ourselves. Therefore, it is important to counter the possible conventional attack of Soviet Russia with conventional weapons. And by that, I don't mean building an equal number of tanks, but by sophisticated weapons. And such weapons have been invented. There are lots of them, non-nuclear, using our strength in electronics, in systems design, and we know from the Israeli invasion of Lebanon that such weapons can be extremely effective. I believe Los Alamos should concentrate on such weapons, on sophisticated non-nuclear weapons to counter a possible Soviet attack on Western Europe, even if this attack is not likely. I believe in the principle of Los Alamos, a non-profit laboratory run for the defense of the country. I think this is a very powerful idea. Whenever the development of weapons is left to industry, you always have to suspect that the industry is interested in their own profits. Los Alamos doesn't make any profit. And therefore, I much rather have the overall direction of such development in the hands of Los Alamos than in the hands of industry. Industry afterwards comes in at the production level. In the years after the Second World War, Los Alamos told the Department of Defense what weapons they want, not the other way around. And this is the way it should be. One should determine the weapons from what is feasible. It is not possible to sit there and say, we want defensive weapons, if the laws of physics are against it. One should be able to strain one's imagination to invent good weapons, and then the laboratory should be able to tell the people in Washington, this we can do, and this will be useful in such and such a way in possible fighting of wars, not have Washington tell us what to do. And this, I think, should now be done with advanced conventional weapons. Now, I realize the great difficulties in changing Los Alamos from a nuclear weapons laboratory to a conventional weapons laboratory. I do think that Los Alamos has the skill, the imagination, the technical knowledge in its members to do it. But it will run into great organizational problems because there are departments in the government. There's the Department of Defense, which supervises most weapons, and especially conventional ones. And there's the Department of Energy, which is charged with the development and production of nuclear weapons. This laboratory has always been financed by the Department of Energy and its predecessors. It will be very difficult to make any change. But I think for the good of the country, this change should be made, that Los Alamos should get away from further nuclear weapons and develop non-nuclear weapons. Now back to nuclear. Arms control is necessary. In spite of what Edward Teller has said, it has had some successes. There is an ABM treaty which makes it possible for our weapons from submarines, submarine weapons being the most survivable of all weapons that we have. The ABM treaty makes it possible to penetrate Russia and to hit, if necessary, Russian targets. The ABM treaty is very valuable to us for this reason, as well as it's being the first treaty which put any limit on any weapons. And if that goes, I think all arms control will go. President Reagan has called for arms reduction. This is good, and I agree with this aim 100%. I believe that arms reduction should take place, large percentage, and that ultimately we should go down to a level which is not zero, but small enough that we would not need to live constantly under the influence of terror. What that level is, I don't know. Some of my friends say 1,000. I think 200 would be enough. I don't think it can be zero, because it is in the capability of any country to build weapons quickly and also to hide small numbers of weapons. And therefore, I don't believe we can go to zero, but we could, by mutual reduction, go to a much lower number. I think also it would be a good idea, as the Scowcroft committee just recommended, to try and go to single warhead missiles. I remember the days just in the late 1950s, when I was a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee, when we were very happy that it was not possible to target an enemy's missile silo, because if you did so, you would lose as much of your own missiles as you would destroy of the enemy's. So I think this would be a good direction, and I hope the Soviets will be willing to get away from that most destructive American invention, the MIRV. I should like to recall that when the MIRV was invented, the Russians showed very good indications that they would be quite willing to forbid MIRV. Our Arms Control and Disarmament Agency at the time said that MIRV, while presently, that is in 1967, in our advantage because we had tested it, would in the long run favor the Russians because they have much bigger missiles. We should have tried very hard not to deploy MIRV, to forbid it, and of course we know when MIRVs are being tested. We can observe the tests. We have observed Russian tests constantly, and we know which of their missiles are MIRV. In fact, the Dr. Perry, who was the Undersecretary for Arms Research and Development, said that in practically every case we know of the existence of a Russian missile even before it is tested, but surely afterwards. The present United States proposal for arms control, and I mean strategic arms control, not theater arms control in Europe, that proposal is not taken seriously by the Soviets. They have pointed out, and in my opinion correctly, that this proposal favors the United States unilaterally so much that they cannot even discuss it. They cannot discuss it also because the man we sent to Geneva for these negotiations, General Rauney, is totally inflexible. If our government is serious about arms control, they have to do two things. One is to change the proposal to something which is more equitable to the two sides. And the other is to replace the negotiator. The other negotiator, Nitze, as far as I can see, is willing to negotiate. And in fact, he was able to arrive at a perfectly reasonable compromise, as the New York Times reported, with his Soviet counterpart. But unfortunately, both the Russian government and the United States government did not endorse this compromise. Well, finally, back to Star Wars. I believe we should, with very high priority, conclude an agreement to ban anti-satellite weapons. The Soviets have submitted a draft treaty to this effect. It is not sufficiently good, but we could amend it. We could make a counter-proposal, which could be satisfactory. We have not done so. Satellites are our eyes. Satellites determine for us the strength of the Soviets. And while in some cases it may be useful to leave the grizzly bear in ignorance, in other cases it is very useful to know approximately the strength of your enemy, and neither to overestimate it, not to underestimate it. The importance of nuclear weapons is to prevent a nuclear attack on the United States and on our allies. It is not war fighting. We need security for our satellites. I think it's a good idea to have additional ones, as Edward has proposed, but I think the security of our satellites would be very severely threatened if we deployed any actual weapons in space which are designed either to fight corresponding weapons of the Soviets or to come to some kind of some combination of defensive and offensive structure. If you follow the line which I have outlined, namely gradual decrease of our weapons to a low number, if we decrease offensive weapons to a small number, then possibly, but only then, do I see any chance that we could go from a predominantly offensive to a predominantly defensive posture. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Don Kerr.
I'd like to begin by offering some propositions which I think dominate a lot of our thinking about weapon systems. I'll try to cover a broader spectrum than simply the new or next or Star Wars generation of nuclear weapons, because the laboratory, in fact, has responsibilities nearer in time than the end of the century, and they range over a wide spectrum of conventional through nuclear weapons. I'll start with the propositions, which are arguable, but provide the basis for the later things I plan to say. First and most importantly, I think that the Soviet Union deliberately seeks to exploit its strategic military capability for political ends, and that the job for the United States is to forestall imbalances, to thwart Soviet intentions, and prevent major conflict. And the focus has to be on the geopolitical setting, not just on the military and technical balance. A critical predicament for the United States is the obligation that we have accepted to provide for the security of states and regions far from the U.S., especially those around the periphery of the Soviet Union, which are totally accessible to their nuclear and non-nuclear power. I believe their first objective in terms of their strategic power and policy is to place stress on our extended security commitments. Their policies and weapon systems are designed to defeat a U.S. strategy which rests on making these commitments effective. Their ability to do this, importantly, but only partly dependent on nuclear forces, I believe to be the real measure of their strategic capability, not simply the counting of strategic systems. The second objective of Soviet strategic power and policy is to provide the Soviet Union an opportunity to translate this new balance of forces into a geopolitical revolution on the periphery of Eurasia before the U.S. and its allies can reestablish an adequate defense equilibrium. And this, to me, is the real window of vulnerability. Again, it's not from counting weapon systems. It's what the weapon systems that exist now and will in the future provide as opportunities that the Soviets can exploit and we cannot counter. The current environment, with interlocked nuclear and other military capabilities, our extended security commitments, and an adversary bent upon revolutionizing the international system, allows the United States no deterrence-only military strategies. With the exception of a counter-value exchange, the United States must be prepared militarily and politically to fight all of the wars it intends to deter and that might occur as a result of political attempts to restrain the adversary. The United States and its allies must do more in the common causes of containment, deterrence, and defense. Specifically, a credible defense for Europe, one that does not simply pose a nuclear response to a non-nuclear attack. Second, effective power projection capabilities to deal with our extended commitments. We and our allies require the capacity to deter Soviet land combat forces on the Eurasian periphery, the forces, for example, that entered Afghanistan. We continue to need the capability to deter Soviet strategic forces, and I believe we need to investigate active and passive defenses to assure national entity survival for the United States. You might ask at this point in time, what deters the Soviet Union, worldwide and particularly in Europe? I think there are 2 or 3 points that one might have in mind answering that question. The first is that despite present disagreements on many matters, there is a fundamental political unity in NATO, an alliance that exists and is very visible to the Soviet Union. Secondly, and perhaps most important, the potential devastation of the Soviet Union by the United States and its allies, should they engage in some aggressive behavior, I think deters them very strongly at this point in time. And thirdly, the prospect of defeat of their offensives, I believe, is a very important point to them if their military literature, like ours, can be believed from the point of view of showing the philosophy under which they train and arm. There are many issues today from a European perspective, particularly because of the questions of providing a credible European defense. Clearly, Europeans don't like the perception that Europe might be a battleground. They do, however, appear to continue to believe in deterrence. They believe in détente in the way it was formulated by Henry Kissinger. They appear in the majority not to believe in unilateralism, that is, unilateral disarmament, and they certainly fear decoupling from the United States' central strategic capabilities. They're confused by a number of arguments and debates going on. For example, the turmoil surrounding the proposed introduction of the neutron bomb, the confusion over NATO's present dual-track approach to deployment of Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles while negotiating for their reduction, a decision taken, in fact, at the suggestion of Germany, first decided in 1977, reinforced in 1979 as alliance policy. And finally, the introduction of what many see as destabilizing weapons, the SS-20 in Europe. What should the U.S. and its allies do about this? At the more abstract level, clearly the United States and NATO have to review and revise their policy for the defense of Europe. They have to rationalize the weapons to the strategy. and in particular deal with the fact that the stockpile in Europe may not be the appropriate one for the 80s. Some have proposed that NATO could get by with about half the administrative burden it now has. The common beliefs that there are too many weapons with uncertain purpose have to be addressed squarely. And most important, there have to be increases in conventional combat readiness and enhanced conventional weapons so there will be a credible response, or at least a credible deterrent, to a Soviet conventional attack in Europe. With regard to the nuclear posture, which might influence the lines that this laboratory would investigate, it would seem to me that at this point in time, only a modest battlefield or short-range tactical weapon capability would be needed, and that only for the purpose of denying the Soviets the use of massed armor. There should be theater forces, in my view preferably ballistic missiles, to attack the rear echelons and hold at risk airfields and the like. There should be submarine-launched missiles assigned to NATO, as some are present, to hold Soviet national assets at risk, things like the launch control centers and the hardened bunkers. And lastly, that has to be supported by survivable U.S. Central Strategic Forces. There's some other initiatives we should take as well, and those are the strategic initiatives that would minimize the risk of an accidental war. For instance, we have the hotline that exists now between the Soviet Union and the United States. It could be enhanced substantially in providing a more real-time communication capability, perhaps even taking up the suggestion Senator Jackson made not so long ago for joint command centers in both countries, manned by men from both countries' armed forces. We should avoid, at all costs, in my view, a hair-trigger command and control system. And I believe we should drop any thoughts of launch on warning and most any thought of launch under attack. Depend on systems like permissive action links, the other technically possible things that we can do to avoid unplanned nuclear detonations and at the same time provide for survivable forces. We shouldn't push the Soviet Union to a hair-trigger response either. I agree with previous speakers, we should improve satellite and ground station survivability. All of the discussion thus far has focused on satellites, their vulnerability in space, but in fact the ground stations, the downlinks, the places where the information goes are more vulnerable in many cases and more at risk if there's a conflict. And lastly, I think the country should adopt a policy that if our intelligence and warning assets are attacked, that would serve as a tripwire for the release of our forces. Only a geopolitical change will alter our military problem. One possible change could be the Soviets would cease imposing pressure on our extended security commitments. Another possibility is that the Soviets would eliminate our extended security commitments, or we might give them up. A third possibility we must think about is that other countries, by alliance or acquiring nuclear weapons, would alter the geostrategic landscape. And lastly, there's the possibility that a major war would intervene to cause one of the prior three to happen. I don't believe there are any pure arms control solutions. The political basis for radical solutions is lacking at this point, I think, on both sides. There's little doctrinal basis for discovering genuinely helpful measures in a context of intimately but unpredictably interlinked military capabilities. And in the last 10 years, I think arms control activity has degenerated into a one-sided and self-defeating demonstration of wholesomeness because it's been decoupled from our military planning and from our weapons development more than it should have been. We also have this curious and profound dilemma where we want to reduce the numbers of nuclear weapons but don't know how to without increasing the threat of use. With the relatively large stockpiles that both countries have, small numerical differences in the stockpiles don't reflect significant military differences in capability. As one moves potentially to smaller numbers, those small numerical differences become dangerous because you've coupled small forces with uncertain verification. And so in that context, one might well suggest limited, perhaps saturable defenses on both sides, even a mechanism similar to the present Standing Consultative Commission. Implicitly, however, one should take note of the fact that you would have to accept a policy of minimum deterrence, which I don't necessarily believe is shared by the Soviets, and it's certainly not shared at this time by a majority in the United States. The main lines of action, as I see it, to support our future strategic policy are first to enhance our conventional capabilities and give the United States the opportunity to become somewhat less dependent for nuclear weapons in all situations. I think we should continue to resist the extension of Soviet power. We should also, I think, resist arms control as an activity unto itself. It's not a separate field. It's part of our national security program and can't be dealt with in a vacuum by separate people outside of the context of real weapons development. And I think we should accept the President's challenge of a few weeks ago, not because we believe in Star Wars, but because for the first time in many years, a United States President has challenged the scientific community to investigate what might be possible in the future other than mutual assured destruction. I don't know that there is a possibility of a cheaper and more effective defense, but for sure, if we don't investigate that possibility, we may not be prepared to deal with the world we face in the next century.
Thank you. We have about 1 hour for discussion. I'm going to call for questions from the floor. I'm not going to ask our speakers to respond in any way. In fact, what I'm going to ask them to do is to resist the temptation to address what other speakers have said and instead to respond to your questions. The purpose of this discussion is to try to increase our understanding of an extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily important subject. It is not our purpose to have each of our speakers persuade the others of the correctness of his views. I am not, based on 30 years of experience, very optimistic about the likelihood of any progress on that front. So I will, what I'm going to ask you to do is raise your hand so we can see you. We have some microphones. We'll bring them to you. Don't ask your questions until you get to a microphone. And I think you ought to address whichever speaker you want to. You make that part of your question so we'll know how to get a response. Professor Beta will be back in just a moment, incidentally. I'm now ready to hear questions. Will you raise your hand so we can get a microphone to you?